All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Bryn Bodayle. As Blake said, I'm a co-organizer here at Nashville CocoaHeads. I'm a freelance iOS developer, so if any of you or your companies are looking for contract or consulting work, just let me know. Talk to me afterwards. So tonight we're going to be talking about auto layout, specifically auto layout in practice, making our lives easier. So I'm going to give some like deep wisdom and knowledge. Not really. But we're just going to focus on some practical, helpful things in auto layouts and practical situations. So looking at our agenda, we'll start off with kind of brief, high-level overview of auto layout. This is going to be kind of an intermediate level talk, just kind of, you should already have an understanding, or hopefully have an understanding of constraints and just a little bit of how auto layout works. We're going to kind of cover some more complex cases and also some newer APIs and such like that. So, so after the high-level overview, we're going to look at a few demo and kind of case studies in a sample project I made. Then we're going to do some tips and tricks, have time for questions. One notable exception is I'm not going to be talking about UITextView, which UITextView is great. It's only available in iOS 9, so I haven't adopted it in too many of my apps. But as per Apple's definition, UITextView is auto layout without the constraints. So tonight we're going to be talking a lot about constraints, and so it wouldn't necessarily apply. But so why auto layout, right? Why are we using auto layout? Well, if you're like me and you remember the dark days of setting frames, that was really not fun. For instance, right, a frame describes a view's position and size in coordinate space, right? Specifically the coordinate space of a super view. So that's nice. But if there's a transform on it, well, you can't use the frame. You got to use the bounds in the center. And so there's lots of calculations and nasty code. Plus, there's not really a great place to put that in a UIView controller, right? You're in a UIView subclass, that's nice. Layout subviews, stuff like that. But not really in view controllers as much. They've added some things through the years to help it a little bit. But yeah, so back in those days, we were working with springs and struts, aka auto resizing masks, and those worked fairly well, but still fairly limited. So yeah, so with auto layout, right, the goal is to respond to changes, right? There's two types of changes. We've got external and internal changes. So external changes, the screen changes dimensions, right, based on what device you're running it on, or the orientation changes, which changes, the size of what you're displaying, or internal changes, right? You've got content changing, you've got dynamic text, you've got your app's localized or internationalized, so text is different depending on what language the user is running. And as we kind of touched on, auto layout relies on constraints. So what's a constraint? Basically, a relationship between two views. So back in the old days, say you wanted to have a view and another view that always shared the same center, right? Well, so whenever so you have to set that view center to the other view center, but whenever the bounds changed or its position changed, you need to make sure those centers stay, in sync. So you'd always, having to update that. Well, in auto layout, you can just explicitly say the center should be the same as this other view's center, horizontally and then vertically. So that'd be two different constraints. So yeah, a brief history of auto layout. It was first introduced in OS X 10.7 line in 2011. So it was on the Mac only, which kind of makes sense, right? Because on the Mac you've got your windows that are always resizing and changing. So back then the Mac was a lot more dynamic as far as things moving around, those external changes. In 2011 we only had iPhone 3.5-inch screen and the iPad. So it's really two sizes. Yeah, some different orientations. But 2012 it became available in iOS 6. Right? With iOS 6 we got the iPhone 5, so we got our new larger 4-inch screen. In 2013, there were some improved tools in Xcode 5, so you had the ability to preview different orientations and device sizes in Xcode, in Interface Builder by just tapping a few buttons on the bottom right corner, which hopefully you know about is really helpful, especially when you're dealing with size classes. In 2014, with iOS 8, layout margins and self-sizing cells were introduced. Self-sizing cells are super helpful, so are layout margins not as helpful, but we're going to be covering both of those. 2015, stack views with iOS 9, layout guides and layout anchors, and we're going to talk about layout guides and layout anchors. They're pretty cool. Yeah, so we're going to dive into a demo real quick here. I've created a demo project, or sample project, and it's going to be available online. So thought of that as kind of a resource. So if you forget some of these concepts, you're trying to figure out something tricky, you can look back on it. And just had some fun making some creative examples here. So let me switch over here to my project. So first thing we're going to talk about, right, is resistance and hugging priorities. And so if you have any questions, can't see anything, or have anything else to add, feel free to jump in. We'll just start here. So, seriously. that was my joke for the presentation.
It worked.
Okay, so content hugging priorities, content compression priorities, they're kind of a tricky thing. A lot of people, it takes a while for it to sink in. It did for me, for sure. So I made this little example here, right? So if we're looking at the content hugging priority, right, that tells, you're telling auto layout, right, which is using these constraints and these properties that you're setting to try to come out with a solution, right? And the solution is like the layout. So you're telling it here with this green label, the content hugging priority, the horizontal hugging priority is 250, and this label is 251. So since this priority is higher, since these views are pinned to each other, it's going to hug the right view, right? And so this view is stretched. So the kind of opposite of that, right, is content compression resistance. And so we're looking at that priority, and see this right label, it has a priority of 1,000. This left label has a priority of 750. And so it looks the same as, the above right now, right? The colors have changed. But if we kind of shrink this view, you'll see here that the green label is going to resist compression, and it's going to stay based on its intrinsic content size. It's going to stay visible, and we're going to talk about intrinsic content size next. But so while this label just gets killed here, and then that one resists all the way till the end, and it gets collapsed here. So so that's your compression resistance. Same thing goes for vertical. It's horizontal. I just did horizontal here. Right. So hugging is if you have a high priority, it's gonna hug the content of the label or whatever intrinsic content size view you're displaying. So could be an image. Could be, in this case it's a label. There are other examples. Could be your own custom view. So that's resistance hugging priorities. Any questions there?
So is the width of that red label explicitly set in Interface Builder?
No, it is not. So these views are just pinned to the sides and then pinned to each other. So it's based on the view of the container view here, the gray view. And then the width is just determined by the intrinsic content size, which we're going to talk about in like 2 seconds. Patrick?
Yeah, so I see content hugging and compression resistance used usually on labels.
Mm-hmm.
So it'll expand or hug the text. Does it have any effect when you use it on a normal UI view, or is it just for views that have content like the labels text?
Yeah, it's if your UI view, if you're not explicitly setting width and height, it and just it will have an effect on pretty much any view actually, right? So say you were even setting a height, right, on two views that were in an area, and that view started shrinking. Well, whichever view had the higher compression resistance is going to stay that height, right? But if if those height constraints are set to priority 1,000, required, it's going to, give you some errors and stuff. Yeah, so intrinsic content size, super helpful concept. It took a while for me to kind of sink into. I didn't find a lot of great resources, and it seemed kind of a little bit hidden, but we're going to take a look at it here. So I've got this UITextView subclass here, and basically what I've set it up to do is that if I start typing gibberish, it will expand. And then I've got constraints set up so that this button, there's constraints between here so that it doesn't expand too far. And then, it's got kind of a minimum size there. So I'll go ahead and to show you the code here for that. Kind of show you one way to do intrinsic content size that's pretty helpful. So let's go right here. So give it a sec. All right, so I've got this custom. Thought I could have my toolbar here. But, so I've got this custom UITextView subclass, right? And we'll look at the constraints I got here. So I got like a center alignment. I've got a width. I've got a height constraint, which isn't required, just in case we're in a very shrunken size of device. But I just want the heights to be greater than 120. And then I got like some top and bottom space. Also got I want it to resist compression vertically, as important on like the smaller sizes. So I've got that there, and then down here you'll see usually this is set to default, which is system defined, but I have it set to placeholder intrinsic content size at 240 and 126. So this is just an interface builder. It goes away at runtime, but where it actually gets the intrinsic content size is here in my subclass, right? So just walk you through this real quick. It's got some styling here, and I've subclass this method intrinsic content size, which is a method on UIView, and you'll see here there's just a few UIView intrinsic. Well, there's really two related to intrinsic content size, but I'm returning what I want the intrinsic content size of that view to be. And the way I'm doing that is whenever the text changes, I'm calculating the size of the text, and then I'm creating a new size. And so for the height, I'm passing in the height of that text. But for the width, I'm saying UIView no intrinsic method. So there's no intrinsic size for that width dimension. So the system will take care of that, or not the system, but the super view, right? So I've set a constraint on that's width, and so the intrinsic content size has no effect on the width, and it just defers to that other constraint. And then I check to see if that size has changed from what it currently is, and if it does, I set that property. And then you call this method called invalidate intrinsic content size, which basically just tells the auto layout system that my content size has changed. You need to relay out some things. And then in order to animate it, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later, is you call layout if needed, which layout if needed immediately applies the constraints, which constraints adjust alignment recs, or you think about the constraints adjusting the frames. Alignment recs are very similar to frames for our purposes. They just have some extra insets on them. But since I'm changing the frames there, well, if I pass this block into my animation, it will animate. So that's how you saw the animation there. And then the view controller, I'm just adjusting, to take into account the keyboard. So intrinsic content size is super helpful. You can let your custom view classes have a size of their own and adjust dynamically based on the content, which is really nice. And it encapsulates that knowledge about what should my size should be in the right place here. So, are there any questions about intrinsic content size? Cool. All right, we'll move on here. Next up, I'm going to look at self-sizing table UI table views, which is pretty straightforward. It can be sometimes tricky to get set up, but it was introduced in iOS 8, and it's really nice because you can have a table view here with dynamic cell heights based on the content here. So I'll just show you what we've got set up here. So we've got our UI table view cell here, and basically just taking the cells and pin them to the sides, and then pin them vertically between each other, or I've added a constraint between there, so that the height of this table view cell is based on the intrinsic content size of these two labels. So I've set them to be multi-line, so that and I have not set any height constraints on them, so that they can be as many, the height necessary to meet those number of lines based on the content. So I haven't explicitly said what the height of this cell is. It's there, just ignore that. You'll see in the controller that what you do to get the self-sizing table views is for your table view, you just set the row height to this UI table view automatic dimension, and then you set an estimated row height. So the estimated row height's really nice because say it lets the table view get loaded without having to get all the heights for the cells. So that's really a win if, say, in the olden days you had like core data object and you were trying to read properties off it every time that you needed to get the height for a cell. Well, now you don't have to fault those objects, and they don't have to be loaded just to show the table view. They're loaded when needed. They're lazy loaded. So that's self-sizing table view cells. Really just comes down to these two properties and setting up your cells so that their height is based on the content within them. And also, this is a case where your content hugging priority and content compression resistance priorities come into play sometimes. So it's kind of interesting that the default isn't required for UI labels, but I basically set their vertical compression resistance priority to required, so that I'm saying you should never compress these. It should always be the height that the content wants it to be. So those are self-sizing table views. Any questions? Or table view cells. Any questions yet?
Is there any difference between setting the table view property for estimated height versus using delegate?
No, not really. I'm pretty sure you can use both too. So
I think it won't. Does it even call the delegate if you've set those properties?
It might not if you set the properties.
Because that could save on performance, so like calling that for every row.
Yeah.
If you already know in advance it's going to be 80 or whatever.
Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, so moving on, talk about layout margins. Layout margins, one of those things that if you're like me, they kind of got in the way a lot, haven't been super useful, but I think through exploring them a little more and trying to understand out how they work, it's made me a lot more likely to use them, and I've used them in a few instances, and it's been pretty nice. So looking at layout margins here, I've got like a few different views like within each other here, and so this content container view, which is the white, kind of this white part up here, it's got some margins set to 20. This blue view's got some margin sets to 30 right here, and you'll see here that this red view, its top constraint is applied to the margin, and so is its bottom constraint here. So what I'm doing right now, if I drag this slider, I'm increasing the margins of this white view, and the blue view is on the top and bottom, not the left and right, but the top and bottom is the constraints are to the margin. So that's why the space increases with the blue view. And the red view is just pinned inside, and it moves according to the margin. So that can be pretty helpful if you're, say you've got a lot of subviews and you want them to all be, X amount of pixels away from the sides of the views, well, you can just pin them to the sides of the margins and then set them all here in this interface builder or in code. But there's this interesting property called preserve super view layout margins. So what that initially sounds like is, well, maybe it'd be cool I could set the margins on like my root level view and have that cascade to all the other views. It kind of had this like global like measurement kind of grid system, but unfortunately it doesn't work that way. But what it does though is if I check this preserve super view layout margins, I'm basically I'm going to enable that property on this blue UI view. So right here, if you switch it, you see that this red view, which is pinned to the margins to the left and right here, it shrinks or it receives the margins of the white view, which is the super view, which is kind of nice. But you'll see that if I make the margins like 26 points and turn that on, nothing happens because it only preserves the super view's layout margins if they're higher than its own margins. So this isn't affecting the view because the super view's layout margin's 26 points, but the view that I'm applying the preserved super layout view margins is 30 points. So it only comes into a place when it's larger. So you see the change there. One other thing with layout margins, which is kind of annoying and has kind of made me use them less, is that the root level UI view of a view controller has some default layout margins set, and you can't change them. And those default margins are 8 points on the left and right, and then the top and bottom is based on the top and bottom layout guides. So that's layout margins. They can be helpful, but there are some limitations to be aware of. So, any questions?
Do you want to briefly talk about, like, right now you just have red in there, but if you have an image and you have whatever aspect fill or fit or whatever, how that's affected?
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, I guess I don't know that I guess I don't know how to answer the question. Like, what are I don't know.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is whether the image shrinks, as those margins increase, whether the sides, whether they fill over the edges, or I mean, I guess that's depending on how you want it to look.
Yeah, I mean, say this red view is an image, right? I think it would really all depend on kind of the content mode of that image, right? So if it was like scale, it would pretty much act the same as this red view. If it was like fit, or if it was fit, it'd act like the red view. If it was scale, it'd try to fit in there. But
and I think you could use the content compression resistance to keep it from stretching or warping the image. If you want it to stay certain height, it'll treat the image as the content that it's trying to.
As long as you have the compression resistance higher than the margin.
Yeah, so that's layout margins. Next is kind of a cool one. It's called layout guides. Or we're talking about layout guides, layout anchors, and these are both introduced in iOS 9. So I hadn't really looked into them much. Usually I target the last two OSs, so iOS 8, iOS 9. So I don't get around to the iOS 9 stuff that quickly. But what you'll see here is this kind of compass rose here, and if you slide this slider, it scales everything up and keeps the same proportions and the font, the labels at scale, so it's not stretching or anything like that. So kind of a contrived example, but just to show you maybe one application of layout guides. But so the thing with layout guides is it's all in code right now, so there's nothing in Interface Builder. So we're gonna jump into code here. So one quick little aside, we'll show you the view controller for this. Nothing really crazy going on here, but I am using this new feature of Xcode 7 called the view dock. And so with the view dock, you can basically drag views up here, which is called your view dock, and access them in IV outlets in your code. So the alternative would be like having these views in your main view but hidden or something like that. So it's kind of nice to just have them docked there and access when needed. So I'll show you what I'm doing there. So I've got these 4 labels docked, and I've got them as properties up here. They're strong, so they don't go away because the views they're not added to the view hierarchy yet. So I'm just calling this setup constraints method, right? And so I'm creating a new UI layout guide. So what a layout guide is it's a way that Apple has designed for you to designate empty space using constraints. So before you might have used like a UI view that was hidden. But with layout guides, you don't have to do that. You can kind of strictly have this auto layout structure, and it's really quite nice. So in this square region is my layout guide. Empty space, there's not a view there. So you create the layout guide. You can only do it in code, unfortunately. I'm going to add it to the container view. And then I'm going to set a width constraint. Now, this constraint might look a little different to you if you're not caught up with everything in iOS 9. This is using something called layout anchors. So layout anchors are really nice. They're basically a new way of creating constraints in code, but they're a lot safer. It's a lot harder to mess things up. They're more concise. I'll just jump down here real quick so you can see that you can really create a constraint in one line, and it's much shorter. So back in the day, you would use, in the iOS 8 days, which are not far behind us, you'd use something like this NS layout constraint with item. It's quite a lengthy method. You've got this janky NS layout attribute, not an attribute thing that you're passing. Then you add, so you create the constraint and add it. With layout anchors, you can create the constraint and set it to active, and it becomes active and is automatically added to the appropriate view. So you'll notice you've got, if you command click in the documentation here, you've got all these anchor properties on UI views now. And so you can basically do dot notation to access that property. It's on layout guide, but it's also on views. And then call these methods constraint equal to constant, or you could even add you can add multipliers and such like that. And there's all these different methods to create the constraints, so it's a lot more type safe. And so yeah, so I'm adding a width constraint here, and you can see the equivalent code in the old syntax down here, and creating a height constraint. So I'm basically making this 50 by 50 region here, and centering it in the container view, both vertically and horizontally. And then I'm going to add these labels to the view. So I'm pulling them off the view docs, so they have, unfortunately, they have auto resizing masks that get turned into constraints. So this is always one big gotcha with auto layout. If you're loading a view from a zib, or if you're creating it in code, it has auto resizing masks automatically on it that will get turned into constraints, so it'll cause some errors. If you don't set it to no, it can cause some errors. So I'm taking all my labels, turning off the auto resizing masks into constraints, and adding them to the container view. And then now I'm going to position them. So with the center layout guide, I'm taking the top anchor, making a constraint equal to the bottom anchor with some padding, which in this case I just left at 0, and then activating that. So really I'm just pinning all these labels to the various corners of this layout guide in the way that they should be. They have got a gray border just so you can kind of see the bounds of the view. And then I'm making a 1-to-1 aspect ratio constraint for the north label. So I'm just saying the width anchor, making a constraint equal to the height anchor, so that gives you that one aspect ratio. If you wanted, you could do a multiplier to get different aspect ratios like you would before with the layout anchors. And then I'm setting equal width constraints for basically making them so that they're all square, and then equal height constraints for the labels so that they maintain that squareness. And then down here, with this, when the slider changes, I'm just changing the width and height of that center layout guide constraints, and then updating the point size of the font. So that's how we get this effect here. And the width and height of the labels they're all kind of connected together so that they remain square, but their width and height is based on that intrinsic content size. And so that's why they grow when I'm just changing the point size. And then the constraints that I've added just make sure they stay all the same width and height and all square. So not too many constraints. It's a lot more concise than the previous APIs, but layout anchors are really nice. It can help you avoid using things like masonry or pure layout, or all those kind of third-party frameworks on top of Bodayle layout that try to help you but make your code kind of stink a little at the same time. So super nice. Layout guides are helpful. I haven't found a ton of uses for them yet. It'll be nice if they get added to Interface Builder as well. But if there are any questions about layout guides and anchors? All right, moving on. Our last kind of topic is UI scroll views, and it's they can be somewhat tricky sometimes to work with auto layout, but I've kind of created an example here, and also just kind of a more robust setup of constraints, just as a reference. But so we've got this keyboard responsive layout. I've got the register button moving up, and it's this whole login container view is within a scroll view. That way I can get this nice keyboard dismissal. And then just for fun / a challenge by another CocoaHeads member, I made a horizontal view and kind of transitioned somewhat nicely between the two. And what that's just using is using size classes. So I've added different constraints based on which size class here. So as you can see, it can get a little messy. You've got all these deactivated constraints based on the size class. Not the most manageable thing to work with, but still there's not that many great alternatives. Stack views. For the iOS 9 folks. So if you're going about adding constraints for different size classes, the way you do that is you just choose which size class you're targeting. So right now it's width any, width height any. Add all your constraints, and then what I did is move to the compact height size class, and then dragged out all my constraints again, and worked with it from there. But yeah, but with scroll views, so there's a great technical note from Apple on this, but when you're working with scroll views in Interface Builder, and I believe in code as well, you'll want to put kind of a view to act as the content view of that scroll view inside the scroll view. And so I've added it here, and I've pinned it to the sides of the scroll view, top, bottom, left, and right. And then one little trick I do, which would be nice to use a layout guide, but alas, not Interface Builder, is I've added another view here that is pinned to the edges of my root level view, and then I've said this view inside the scroll view, I've said that it needs to have equal widths and heights to this view. That way the scroll view is always the size of this area, and I can, and then to get the scrolling behavior, I've just said always bounces vertically to yes on the scroll view. So that's a little bit on scroll views, and kind of trickier layout if you want to, dig into that and maybe find some ways to do things. But I kind of also worked to make it work on the 4S. So I kind of combined a lot of the things we talked about, tweaked around with the priorities a lot, have some optional constraints and whatnot, and it works okay. Pretty compressed. The horizontal actually works okay, but yeah, I was able to make it kind of fit, which is it's pretty tricky on the 4S these days. But yeah, that's scroll views. Any questions with that, or Patrick?
What are you doing in response to the keyboard coming up that's selecting that register button?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that's another thing that you can totally reference in this project. But basically, I've got some logic in here to adjust things differently based on if you're in landscape or portrait. But I'm subscribing to the keyboard will change notification. Grabbing the rect value of the keyboard end frame, making sure to convert it to my view's coordinate system, and then updating the layout for the keyboard frame, and then calling layout if needed within an animation block using the animation curve and duration of the keyboard animation. And then here I've just got some constraints that I'm updating the constant values based on that. So it's a pretty standard thing. Some people make like dummy views that are like kind of respond and behave like as the keyboard. So maybe that's something you could do with layout guides, and might be kind of nice. But yeah, so that's scroll views. And so this project's up on GitHub. If you have any questions about it, let me know, any issues, or if you've got some kind of tricky auto layout problem that you want to see like a demonstration of, I'd be happy to kind of add some things here. It was pretty fun to make and come up with examples. So yeah, moving back into slides here. Just going to go over some tips and tricks, and then we'll have time for like general questions and stuff. So some Xcode shortcuts real quick. These are super helpful. I'll actually jump back into Xcode to show you real quick. But yeah, so I'll just use my launch screen, why not? So say I drag a label out here, and I've been, the frame's all kind of out of whack. Well, command =, you can fit to content, which is really nice. So just hit command =, it fits to the intrinsic content size of that view. They're all up here if you forget size to fit content. Well, another one that's super helpful, say I drag this over here, well, interface builder goes all yellow, because the frame of this is not accurate with auto layout, so usually you do like update frames and that fix it. But the shortcut for that is command shift =, or well, actually command option =. So if you just hit command option =, it pops that into place. When you're dragging constraints, of course, you want to control drag. So say I wanted to pin that to the top, I drag up. Say I want to pin that to the bottom, drag down. But say you're dragging, right? Well, if you hold shift, you can select more than one of these, which is kind of nice, and then add constraints. So if you forget that, it's just right here. I never read that ever, so that's pretty nice.
Hold shift.
And then hold option for alternates. This is a great one, which I did discover, fortunately. But so say you're dragging your constraint out. Well, you toggle option, and you get some different options here. So this is how you can go to the container margin, right? Center horizontally within margins, or you can even get this aspect ratio 1:1. So that's super nice, especially when you're dealing with your root view, which has those default locked into place layout margins, and you don't want those. You just hold that option key and you're good. So those are some helpful shortcuts. Kind of really speed things up. Auto layout.
Is your presentation also going to be on GitHub? Or?
Yes. Yes. So next, something I found a little helpful is updating constraints in code. Right, you've got these 5 different methods, and they all sound really similar, and you don't necessarily know which one to call or what to do when you update some constraints in code. So I'm just going to run through these real quick. I've got some resources at the end of the talk that you can look at, and some links. But there's a really great Objective-C.io article on auto layout, which really goes into depth and does a great job of kind of explaining the layout engine from top to bottom, how it runs through your app and creates that solution using your constraints and applies that to the views. So the first method, you got update constraints if needed. This is not a method that you subclass. This is a method that you call if you want up-to-date information about your constraints. So say you want to read some of the constant values, say some things might have changed and you need to get the most up-to-date information to read off the constraints, you call update constraints if needed. Update constraints, this is the method that you subclass. This is kind of a measurement pass. So these are all UIView methods. Update constraints, if you've got like a UIView and you need to set up some constraints for the subviews of that, well, a common practice, and it's pretty recommended, is to create your constraints and update constraints. But you want to keep a flag so that you don't add the constraints again, because this method will get called multiple times. Don't ever remove constraints in this method, because that would definitely screw things up. And don't invoke drawing or layout, because it's the wrong time in the auto layout pass to do that. Next, you got set needs update constraints, which is kind of the sibling method of this update constraints method. If you're familiar with things like set needs layout, which calls layout subviews eventually, and then set needs display, which we'll call your draw rec. It's a way for you to tell the system, hey, you need to update these constraints, and you need to call my draw rect again. But it's a more performant way because it does it at another time, and if you call it a lot in multiple places, it just does it all in one pass. The next time it does the drawing pass or the constraints pass. So sets needs layout, you'll call, or set needs update constraints. You're just telling the system that you need to call this update constraints method. So say I'm going to do some stuff in here to change some constant values. That's when you would call that method. Set needs layout is older method that predates auto layout, but basically tells the system at the next layout pass to apply the solution of the constraints. So I think it will kind of jump these two methods and go straight to applying those constraints to the views. And then layout, if needed, we touched on that briefly. It's the great one that immediately applies the constraint solution. So sets all those frames, sets all those alignment recs, so that you can do animation. So just remember that. That's the one you want to call when you're trying to animate between constraints. So best practices. Don't over-constrain things. That's a huge one. See a lot of messy layouts that just have a ton of constraints, a lot of unnecessary aspect ratio constraints, widths on labels. Don't put heights on labels, because the font size needs to determine that. And sometimes you can even look in the Twitter app and there's G's that are cut off at the bottom, right? So really try not to set widths or heights on labels. Sometimes you need a width, but usually use the content size. Use that intrinsic content size of the view to set its dimensions. Subviews shouldn't add constraints on their size. They should use intrinsic content size. Don't set a width and a height in a subview, right? That's as crazy as setting the frame of a subview, or setting a subview's frame from within that subview, right? That's the responsibility of the parent. That's the responsibility of the superview to set those width and height constraints. Talked about a little translate auto-resizing mask into constraints, set that to no. If you're using constraints, that can be able to source a lot of problems. We all forget it sometimes. I do. And then try to write less code. Use constraints to your advantage. There's a certain point where you do need to drop into code. You can't do everything in Interface Builder, but the advantage of constraints is you're not having to do as many calculations, and you can rely on this this constraint system that is finding the solution for you. So. So I guess one quick thing on over-constraining things, right, is kind of the two problems you can have in auto layout is you can have over-constrained layout, and the opposite of that, though, is an ambiguous layout. So an ambiguous layout, fortunately, you'll get warned in Interface Builder. You'll have red exclamation marks everywhere and say, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. Well, the opposite of that is if it's over-constrained, what will happen then is you'll get that big log message in your console, and it'll recommend some stuff. So talking about debugging constraints kind of ties into that. there's some methods that shouldn't be used in production code, but are helpful if you want to debug things in code, which I haven't found myself doing, but it's useful to cover. First off, use the view debugger to inspect live constraints. That's actually not in code, but so you'll see here, I'll just run my app real quick. The view debugger is super helpful, highly recommend it, but at some point they added the ability to inspect constraints. And it's not great, but you know, when you're running your app, you hit the view debugger, it'll pause things like you hit a breakpoint. This little icon right here, super your friend. So you get this kind of reveal Spark Inspector type view. And to view the constraints, you hit this little button right here, and it tries to show them. Or maybe that's not even what that button does, but you can inspect things here. Well, maybe it is. Oh, something happens. But yeah, so you can inspect constraints here, which can be helpful. I've used it from time to time. So that's one helpful tool. But say you're trying to do things in code, maybe it creates some helpful utilities. Well, you've got this this method, constraints affecting layout for axis, and you can pass in like horizontal or vertical. And this method is what that log uses that tells you, hey, you've got a lot of constraints here, and we can't solve this because it's over-constrained in a certain dimension. And it's like, look at these, see if there's something you're not expecting. If something you didn't expect, and it says auto-resizing mask in the constraints, something like that, that's one of those cases where you need to say, don't translate auto-resizing mask into constraints. And then these last two, you've got this Boolean, has ambiguous layout. This is what interface builder uses all the time. And it's like, oh, this is ambiguous, this is ambiguous. But auto layout doesn't call this ever for performance reasons. But if you're debugging, you can call it and see if your layout's ambiguous. And then you can call exercise ambiguity in layout, which is kind of fun. That will show you different options for that ambiguous layout, right? So it's ambiguous. You have an ambiguous layout, which means there's multiple solutions. So it will show you variations of that solution, which would be kind of nice because then you can see, oh, I need to set left-right constraint here. It kind of might give you a little hint. So that's debugging constraints. Yeah, it's some wrapping up here, some helpful resources. Apple's auto layout guide, their documentation is great on this. It's a helpful blog post, auto layout best practice for minimum pain, a lot of good stuff, a lot of the best practices. This is the Objective-C.io article, auto layout toolbox, really goes into depth. Definitely recommend that. Helpful resources as well. There's WWDC talks, there's a few others. And then if you're interested more in the view debugging stuff, there's a great Wenderlich tutorial. So talk resources are here. We will share them on the group pages and stuff like that. But yeah, so if you have any questions, let me know. We can talk for a little bit, do some more questions. But yeah, feel free to reach out to me, Twitter, email. Also, the Nashville Dev Slack channel is really great. We've got like an iOS group there, and we'll have some conversations sometimes. So always helping people out there. So. Any questions?
That Slack channel you're talking about?
Yeah.
Is that on the CocoaHeads Nashville website? Or
This is an alley.
Okay.
No, it's just an actual dev.
Okay.
Just Google an actual dev site.
All right. Okay.
We'll send that out.
Yeah. Patrick.
I wonder if you're thinking about debugging constraints that might be helpful is, like, if you're ever getting that log or debugger that's like, constraints or whatever, it can be really hard to figure out what the constraints are, like which ones it's talking about, because it'll be like, UIView centered on UIView. It's like, okay, that could be anything. But one way to make that more helpful is in the storyboard, you can give constraints an identifier, and it'll actually print that identifier instead of just saying UIView XYZ, like whatever it may be. So that can make that log a lot more helpful in actually figuring out which constraints are breaking. If you have a lot of different things.
Nice. Yeah, that's super helpful. I didn't know that, but yeah, set identifiers on your constraints, help debugging.
It's in the link to spec your family.
Nice. Yeah. Also, I think they do have a kind of a conditional breakpoint you can put in so that the breakpoint fires whenever that exception is reached. which would be nice for debugging that. I think it says that in the log message. So I think I've noticed that log message isn't always called. Sometimes they just give up on you and they're like, well, your constraints are screwed up. So.
Also, I actually recently found this out that you can actually create outlets or outlets to your constraints directly. So you can set those properties to update in real time. I'm not sure if you covered that.
Yeah.
It's just a pain to keep in mind.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, all throughout this app. Yeah, it wouldn't work without those outlets and constraints.
But you can't programmatically change the priority or multiplier constraints.
Yeah, there's always like the
Weird.
there's always a button.
Yeah.
And constant.
Yeah, constraints are fun. A lot of headaches sometimes, but just give it time, and it will really save you time in the long run.
Did you? I guess everybody is that common knowledge about the TIE Finder and using that. You guys, I mean, everybody pretty much knows about using that in interfit into storyboards and stuff, right?
Yeah, the bottom right button.
Yeah.
I actually never use that button just because of the shortcuts and stuff like that. But hopefully.
You said there's a button to update frames. Is there a different command to update constraints?
You mean
Like I forgot what it was, like option command something, and then it updated the frame back. You know, and the yellow ones.
Yeah, that's the option command option =.
Is there another one to instead of update frames, update constraints?
What do you mean by update constraints?
Like if you moved it to where you, well, I guess you said.
The suggested constraints? So you so like the fixes at the bottom.
Yeah, the bottom right
set update frame or update
Some of the
constraints.
shortcut.
Like if you have it where you want it. Like
You can reset to suggested constraints.
You can update the constraints from that same, each asking for the keyboard.
it's I can just.
Okay. Sorry. Yeah. Yeah, we can look afterwards. Cool. That's it.
Thank you.